y'all, welcome to Robin on the Farm. Today I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful and delicious loaf of sourdough sandwich bread. This is a real loaf of sourdough bread. There is no commercial yeast in this loaf, so it's not a sourdough discard recipe. This is only leavened by sourdough starter or wild yeast, and look how beautiful it is. It has a really nice rise, it's a beautiful golden brown color, and it has that yummy sourdough tang. Oh, it is so delicious. This is a really easy loaf to make using your bread machine dough cycle. So I use my bread machine, I use the dough cycle, I shaped it into a loaf, I let it rise a really good long time, and then I baked it in the oven. And this is the result. Isn't it beautiful? So I'm gonna show you how to make it today. It's a really easy recipe. Let's just get started. For this sourdough bread, I'm gonna use my sourdough starter Hester. This is a strong, established starter. You can see she's ripe and bubbly and active and perfect to use in this bread. This wild yeast is what will leaven the bread and cause it to rise. So this isn't a discard recipe. You want active, strong starter for this bread. I'm going to use 65 grams or 1/3 of a cup, and I'll give you the recipe in grams and in cups and spoons, just depending on how you like it. If you need a shortcut to sourdough, I have my starters freeze-dried and available on my website, robinonthefarm.com. And because it's freeze-dried and it's stored in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber, it will last for years and years and years. So that's how I like to store my sourdough starter in my food storage. And next I'm going to add 300 grams or 1 1/3 cups of water. Now you want this water to be room temperature to warm, about 80 to 90 degrees is perfect. And it's best when you're using sourdough starter or wild yeast that you use unchlorinated water. So some filtered water works the very best. Be sure to zero out your scale in between the addition of each of the ingredients. That's so easy to forget to do. Now I'm going to add some of this coconut oil. I really like this coconut oil, but you can use any oil that you want to in this bread. Maybe some olive oil, some sunflower oil, any kind of oil will work great. So I'm going to use 20 grams of this oil, or that's about 1½ tablespoons. And if you under or over measure like I seem to do every single time, it's not that big of a deal. Now I'm going to add 28 grams of sugar, which is about 2 tablespoons. You can also use honey if you'd rather do that, but I'd add about 14 grams or 1 tablespoon of honey just because it's so much sweeter than sugar. Once you have your sugar added, now it's time for some salt. Be sure to zero out your scale. Don't forget to do that. But I am going to add this Redmond's Real Salt. This is the salt that I prefer, but you can use any kind of salt that you want. But you're going to want 9 grams of salt, which is about 2 teaspoons. So just add that right on into your bread machine loaf pan. I love to use a scale when I'm making sourdough bread. It really is easier and you're not having to get out all of the utensils, and I just really enjoy it. So if you've never tried to use a scale in your baking, give it a try. I think you might really like it. Now I'm going to zero out my scale one more time, and it's time to add the flour. I'm going to use bread flour, but you can also use all-purpose flour just fine. I'm going to use 500 grams or 4 cups of this bread flour. The bread flour has a higher protein content than the all-purpose flour, so your gluten will develop better and you'll get a better rise out of your bread. If you happen to have some Vital Wheat gluten, you can add about 1 tablespoon of that right now if you're using all-purpose flour, or even if you're using bread flour, and you'll get an even better rise out of your bread. But that's totally optional, and I'm not going to use any Vital Wheat gluten in this bread today. So now we have 500 grams or 4 cups of this flour. And those are all of our ingredients for the sourdough bread. Now it's time to move this on over and pop it into the bread machine. I'm using my very favorite bread machine of all time. This is my Zojirushi Supreme bread machine. I'm going to pop my bread machine loaf pan into the bread machine, and I'm going to choose the dough cycle. Now the very most important part of using your bread machine is checking on your ball of dough just a few minutes into the kneading cycle. It is not true that you can just throw all your ingredients into the bread machine and it's going to magically make you a fantastic loaf of bread. You really have to look at your ball of dough and adjust it if it needs it. But I like to come in a few minutes after it starts kneading, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and come in with a rubber spatula, get all of those extra ingredients off the sides of the bread machine loaf pan, and check on your ball of dough. You want to make sure it's not sticking to the sides and to the bottom. If it is, that means it's too wet and you need to add a little bit more flour. If it's really dry and crumbly and not coming together into a nice smooth ball of dough, that means you need a little bit more water. So this ball of dough looks fantastic. This is what you want your ball of dough to look like. So now that I know it looks good, I can confidently shut the door of my bread machine and leave it until the dough cycle is done. It's been an hour and a half and the dough cycle is finished. Now, if you've ever used your dough cycle and you're used to yeast breads, you might think this looks really flat and like it didn't rise at all. Well, that's true. Sourdough takes a really long time to rise, so don't expect your dough to look any different than this. This looks exactly right. Now it's time to turn our dough out from the bread machine loaf pan, press it out, and shape it into a loaf. I like to use this dough mat. That way I know that it's clean and there's nothing gross on my countertop. If your paddles come out with your dough like mine just did, make sure you get your paddle out of there. Now I'm simply just going to press out my dough. Press it out, get all the little air bubbles out of it. And I'm going to use my 8.5 by 4.5 inch cast iron loaf pan. I oiled it up really well, and I always try to press out my dough about as wide as my loaf pan is long so that my loaf fits in there really well. Now that my loaf pan's prepared and my dough is all pressed out, I'm going to just roll this into a loaf. I like to do the head down, shoulders in method. So I pull the head down or the top, I pull in the shoulders, I press it out with the palms of my hand, and then I just continue to roll it nice and tight into a log. And this just gives you really good surface tension, and it gives you a really pretty loaf of bread. So this is how I like to do it, but just make sure you roll it nice and tight. It doesn't have to be a science or any more complicated than it needs to be, but definitely pinch your seams together, pat it out a bit to help it relax, shape it really nicely, kind of smooth out the top, and that's all there is to it. When you're done with that, just throw it into your loaf pan. Now it's time to let this sourdough bread rise. I don't want this dough to dry out while it's rising, so I cover it with plastic wrap. I spray the top of the plastic wrap and then I flip it over so that as the dough rises, it doesn't stick to the plastic wrap. This dough is going to need to sit for about 6 to 8 hours to rise. Once it peaks over the edge of the loaf pan, we'll know it's ready to go into the oven. So I'm going to leave this on my countertop, just like this, for about 6 hours, and then I'm going to throw it in the oven. This sourdough sandwich bread has been sitting on my countertop for exactly 6 hours and 23 minutes. The dough is peeking over the edge of the loaf pan, and I know that it's ready to go into the oven. So I have my oven preheated to 350 degrees, and I'm going to score the top of this dough before baking it in the oven. I'm going to do 4 simple diagonal slashes on the top. This will help the bread to not burst while it bakes, and it looks pretty too. Now I'm going to bake it at 350 degrees for 35 minutes. If you want to see what your bread will look like if you let it rise too long, be sure to stay to the end. Look, y'all. I got our sourdough sandwich bread out of the oven. I let this bake at 350 degrees for 35 minutes. Look how good it looks. You can let yours go however long you want so that it's nice and brown on top, however brown you want it. But this is how I like mine, and I think it looks fantastic. So now it's time to turn it out of the loaf pan. I like to turn it out right away when I get it out of the oven. I just like the texture the best that way. And see how nicely it slid out of the loaf pan because I oiled it up really well? Oh, look at this gorgeous loaf of bread. And it smells so good too. I mean, it smells just phenomenal. Look at that, it's baked perfectly. Looks good, doesn't it? Okay, this is what I like to do. I like to take my little melting pot. I have some melted butter in here, and I am just gonna put some butter on top of this loaf. I like this buttery flavor it gives it. I like the shine, and I think it gives you a nice soft crust, and I like that for my bread. But if you'd rather, you can put this on a cooling rack, but I like mine like this, slathered with butter all over the crust. Now that the bread is buttered up really well, this is what I like to do. I like to grab a tea towel, and I like to cover my loaf of bread with a tea towel while it cools. And this will just give you a really nice soft crust. That's what I like. But if you prefer a little bit crunchier crust, then go ahead and put it on a cooling rack. But this is what I like. Now, I'm gonna let this cool just for a little bit. If you let your bread cool and then slice it, it'll slice easier. You'll get a better crumb, better texture to your bread. But, you know, I like to eat nice warm bread. So I'm just gonna let it cool for a little bit, and then I'm gonna cut into it and we'll check it out. Okay, I've let our sourdough sandwich bread cool just a bit, and I wanted to be sure that you could see the crumb on this gorgeous bread. So let's go ahead and cut into this. It's still pretty warm, but that's okay. Oh my goodness. Look at that. Gorgeous. This is such a beautiful loaf of sandwich bread. And I love that it's totally made with sourdough, no commercial yeast. Oh, it is soft and fluffy. It's great for sandwiches, and it's substantial enough that you can spread your jelly or your peanut butter or anything like that and it won't just fall apart. So this is a fantastic loaf of bread. Let me take a little bite of this piece. So good. I love the sourdough tang, and this bread definitely has that. So good. Look how beautiful. To store my loaf of sourdough sandwich bread, I'm going to use this beeswax bread bag. This is an organic beeswax bread bag that my daughters and I make together. And aren't they cute? These are 11 by 17. This is the botanical pattern, and I just love the colors in it. So I'm going to store my sourdough bread in this beeswax bread bag. Now, beeswax is naturally antimicrobial, antibacterial. It keeps your bread fresh without it molding. So, in an effort to use a little bit less plastic in the kitchen, I'm trying to make some really simple changes, and I just feel like this is better than putting my bread in a plastic bag all the time. So I've been really happy with these beeswax bread bags. I'll leave the recipe down in the description for the sourdough sandwich bread and also the link to our beeswax bread bags. You can find them on robinonthefarm.com. Thank you so much for being here with me on Robin on the Farm. I will see you next time. If you're interested to know what'll happen if you let your bread rise a little bit too long, well, this is what it'll look like. I totally forgot that I got this bread started the night before. I let it do an overnight rise. I got up in the morning, I worked out, I did some chores, and I came into the kitchen to see this. Way overproofed. It sat on my countertop for 13 hours, and this is what it looked like. But I said, I'm gonna go ahead and bake this bread anyway. So I popped some of the bubbles, I scored it, I threw it into the oven, and I baked it. And you know what? It turned out great. The funny thing is that 2 of my kids commented on how great the bread tasted. So if yours overproofs and you think it's probably going to be terrible, bake it anyway and go ahead and eat it. And I think you'll be surprised how good it is.
Robin's in the kitchen, dough beneath her hands, wheat from the fields and eggs from her land. Sunlight through the window, a warm golden glow. She's working hard to make that dough.